Hey there, it's me, BZ Boy. So, let's talk about a document that's over 230 years old but still manages to be the subject of heated debates, Supreme Court cases, and maybe even your dinner table arguments. I'm talking about the United States Constitution. It's the foundational text of American government, but it wasn't perfect from the start. The framers knew this. They built in a mechanism for change, a way for future generations to refine, correct, and expand upon their work. This mechanism is the amendment process. Today, we're breaking down all 27 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. These amendments are more than just historical footnotes. They are the living, breathing part of the Constitution that shapes our daily lives in ways we often don't even realize. They protect our most fundamental freedoms, define our rights as citizens, and structure the very government that serves us. They tell a story of a nation constantly striving, sometimes stumbling, but always aiming to form a more perfect union. Understanding these amendments is crucial to understanding what America is, what it has been, and what it can be. They are the battlegrounds, where our collective values are fought for and codified into law. So, we're going to go through them, one by one, from the foundational Bill of Rights, to the most recent, and rather strange addition concerning Congressional Pay. This will be a bit of a whirlwind tour, a constitutional marathon if you will, but my hope is that by the end you'll have a clearer picture of how this remarkable document has evolved over 2 centuries. It's a journey through American history, law, and identity, so grab a notebook, get comfortable, let's get started. Alright, let's start with the big one, the headliner, the one everyone knows, or at least thinks they know, the First Amendment. Ratified in 1791 as part of the Bill of Rights, it's the bedrock of American expression. It famously protects 5 key freedoms: religion, speech, the press, assembly, and petition. It establishes that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This is the source of the separation of church and state principle, a concept that has been endlessly debated and litigated. It means the government can't create a national church, nor can it stop you from practicing your faith. Then you have freedom of speech and the press, which are really 2 sides of the same coin of expression. It's the right to criticize the government without being thrown in jail, to publish unpopular opinions, and to access information. Of course, this right isn't absolute. You can't, as Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously noted, falsely shout fire in a theater and cause a panic. The final 2 are the right to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This means you can gather for protests, marches, and meetings, and you can formally ask the government to fix a problem. These 5 freedoms work together to ensure that citizens can think freely, express themselves, and challenge power. Moving on to another superstar of constitutional debate, the Second Amendment. Its text reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." For centuries, the interpretation of these 27 words has been a source of profound division in American society. Is it about a collective right for states to maintain militias, like the National Guard, or is it an individual right for any citizen to own firearms for self-defense? It's a question that pits public safety against individual liberty. Historically, the focus was often on the well-regulated militia clause, suggesting the right was tied to militia service. However, in the 2008 Supreme Court case District of Columbia versus Heller, the court affirmed for the first time that the amendment protects an individual's right to possess a firearm for traditionally lawful purposes, such as self-defense, within the home. This decision reshaped the legal landscape, but didn't end the debate. The Heller decision also stated that the right is not unlimited, and that certain regulations, like prohibiting felons from owning guns or banning particularly dangerous weapons, are still constitutionally permissible. The Second Amendment remains a powerful and polarizing force in American politics and law. Now for an amendment that you probably don't think about very often, the third. It states, "No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any private house, without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law." This might seem obscure, but in the 1700s, this was a huge deal. The British Quartering Acts forced American colonists to house and feed British soldiers in their own homes, at their own expense. It was seen as an incredible violation of the sanctity and privacy of one's home. The Third Amendment was a direct response to that grievance. It established a clear boundary between the military and the private lives of citizens. In peacetime, It's an absolute ban. No soldiers as roommates unless you say so. In wartime, it's not a free-for-all. Congress has to pass a law detailing how it would work. While it's the least litigated amendment in the Constitution, some legal scholars argue its spirit informs a broader right to privacy, protecting the home from governmental intrusion. It's a quiet but important reminder that the framers were deeply concerned with limiting the power of a standing army over the civilian population. The Fourth Amendment is, well, kind of like your personal force field against the government. It protects, in its own words, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. So, what does that mean for you? Well, basically, law enforcement can't just barge into your house, rifle through your belongings, or search you on the street without a valid reason. Generally, for a search to be considered reasonable, the police need a warrant, which they can only get from a judge by showing probable cause. That's a reasonable belief, based on evidence, that a crime has been committed. This is really a cornerstone of our justice system, a check on the power of the police. But, like other rights, it's not absolute. The courts have carved out exceptions, like evidence that's in plain view or searches conducted when a person is being arrested. And honestly, modern technology has thrown a wrench into things. Does the Fourth Amendment protect the data on your smartphone, your emails, your location history? The Supreme Court has been grappling with these questions, trying to apply 18th century principles to 21st century realities. In Carpenter verse, the Fifth Amendment is honestly a bundle of rights, a veritable legal Swiss Army knife for people accused of crimes. You've definitely heard the phrase, "I plead the Fifth." That refers to the right against self-incrimination. You cannot be compelled to be a witness against yourself. This is actually why police are required to read you your Miranda rights, which include the right to remain silent. The amendment also guarantees the right to a grand jury for serious federal crimes, which decides if there's enough evidence to even bring charges. This acts as a check before a trial even begins. Furthermore, the Fifth Amendment includes the double jeopardy clause, meaning you can't be tried for the same crime twice once you've been found not guilty. It also contains the famous due process clause, stating that no one shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This is a fundamental promise of fairness in legal proceedings. Finally, it includes the takings clause. If the government needs to take your private property for public use, a practice called eminent domain, they have to pay you just compensation. So, from silence in the interrogation room to the value of your land, the Fifth Amendment is a powerful shield for the individual against the state. If the Fifth Amendment protects you before a trial, the Sixth Amendment ensures fairness during the trial itself. It's really all about making sure the deck isn't stacked against the accused. First, it guarantees the right to a speedy and public trial. Speedy, so you're not left languishing in jail for years awaiting your day in court. And public, to ensure transparency and prevent secret, unjust proceedings. You also have the right to an impartial jury, a group of your peers who will decide your fate based on the evidence presented, not on preconceived biases. The amendment also gives you the right to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, meaning the government has to tell you exactly what you're being charged with. You have the right to be confronted with the witnesses against you, which is the right to cross-examine those who testify against you. And crucially, you have the right to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. This was famously expanded in the 1963 case Suing, where the Supreme Court ruled that the government must provide a lawyer to anyone accused of a serious crime who cannot afford one. These rights collectively form the blueprint for what we consider a fair criminal trial. The Seventh Amendment is a bit of a deep cut, but it's important. While the Sixth Amendment deals with juries and criminal trials, the Seventh guarantees the right to a jury in certain civil cases. These are lawsuits between people or organizations, usually over money or property, not criminal charges. The amendment says that in suits at common law, where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved. Now that $20 threshold is obviously a bit dated. It was a decent amount of money in 1791. Today, federal law has set the bar much higher, usually at $75,000, for a case to be heard in federal court. But the principle remains. If you're suing someone, or being sued, over a significant dispute, you have the right to have a jury of ordinary citizens, not just a single judge, decide the facts of your case. The amendment also specifies that once a jury has made a decision, its finding of facts can't be overturned by another court, except according to the rules of common law. This really shows how much the framers valued the role of the common citizen in the justice system, not just in criminal matters but in everyday disputes as well. The Eighth Amendment is short, but powerful. It prohibits three things: excessive bail, excessive fines, and cruel and unusual punishments. The first two parts are straightforward. The government can't set an impossibly high bail just to keep someone in jail before they're convicted, nor can it levy a fine that is wildly disproportionate to the crime. The goal is to ensure that the punishment, even pre-trial, fits the crime, and that poverty alone doesn't determine whether someone stays in jail. The cruel and unusual punishments clause is where things get really complex and controversial. What exactly counts as cruel and unusual? The standards have evolved over time. Punishments that were common in the 18th century, like branding or public flogging, are now universally considered cruel and unusual. Today, the debate almost always centers on the death penalty. Is capital punishment in itself a violation of the Eighth Amendment? The Supreme Court has said no, but it has placed limits on it, ruling it unconstitutional for juvenile offenders or for crimes that did not result in the death of the victim. This clause forces every generation to ask itself what the limits of justice are and what it means to punish humanely. The Ninth Amendment is one of the most fascinating and mysterious parts of the Constitution. It's a safety net. It says, "The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people." In plain English, this means that just because a specific right isn't listed in the Bill of Rights, it doesn't mean the people don't have it. The framers, especially James Madison, were worried that if they made a list of rights, future governments might argue that it was an exhaustive list, and that any right not on it didn't exist. The Ninth Amendment was their way of saying, hey, this list is not complete. It acknowledges that people have fundamental rights that exist independent of the government or the Constitution. For a long time, this amendment was largely ignored by the courts. But in the 20th century, it became a key part of arguments for a constitutional right to privacy. In the landmark 1965 case Griswold v. Connecticut, which struck down a law banning contraceptives, Justice Arthur Goldberg wrote a concurring opinion arguing that the right to marital privacy was one of those fundamental retained rights protected by the Ninth Amendment. It's a powerful declaration that our liberties are vast and not limited to what's written on parchment. The 10th Amendment is the final piece of the Bill of Rights, and it's all about the balance of power. It states, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. This is really the cornerstone of American federalism, the idea that power is shared between the national government and the state governments. So it basically says that if the Constitution doesn't specifically give a power to the federal government and doesn't ban the states from having it, then that power belongs to the states or to the people themselves. This creates a constant tension. Where does federal power end and state power begin? For example, things like education, marriage laws, and most local law enforcement are traditionally handled at the state level because they aren't powers granted to the federal government. However, the federal government has found ways to influence these areas, often through its spending power or its power to regulate interstate commerce. The 10th Amendment is the go-to argument for those who advocate for states' rights in a more limited federal government. It ensures that our government isn't a single, all-powerful entity, but a complex system with multiple centers of power. Now, we move out of the Bill of Rights and into the subsequent amendments. The 11th, ratified in 1795, is a bit technical, but addresses a fundamental question of power. It deals with something called sovereign immunity. The amendment essentially limits the ability of people to sue states in federal court. Specifically, it says that federal courts don't have the authority to hear cases brought against a state by citizens of another state, or by citizens of a foreign country. It's a bit of a mouthful, honestly. This amendment was passed in direct response to a 1793 Supreme Court case, Chisholm v. Georgia, where the court ruled that a citizen of South Carolina could sue the state of Georgia for debts owed from the Revolutionary War. The states were outraged. They saw this as a violation of their sovereignty and power. They really didn't want to be dragged into federal court by out-of-state individuals. So, the 11th Amendment was quickly passed to overturn that decision. It reinforces the idea that states are sovereign entities that can't just be treated like any other defendant in a lawsuit, at least not in federal court by out-of-staters. The 12th Amendment, ratified in 1804, was a necessary patch to fix a major glitch in the original design for electing the president and vice president. Initially, the Constitution said that each elector in the Electoral College would cast 2 votes for president. The person with the most votes became president, and the runner-up became vice president. This sounded fine in theory, but it led to disaster in the election of 1800. The 2 Democratic-Republican candidates, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, ended up tied. This threw the election to the House of Representatives and created a major political crisis. To prevent this from happening again, the 12th Amendment changed the process. It requires electors to cast 1 distinct vote for president and a separate distinct vote for vice president. No more runner-up VPs. This recognized the reality of political parties, which the original framers hadn't fully anticipated. It ensured that the president and vice president would almost always be from the same political ticket, creating a more unified executive branch. It's a perfect example of how the Constitution can be amended to fix practical problems that arise over time. We now arrive at one of the most consequential amendments in American history, the 13th. Ratified in 1865 in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, its first section is simple, powerful, and transformative. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. With these words, the Constitution was fundamentally altered to formally and permanently abolish the institution of chattel slavery that had existed in America for over 240 years. This was the first of the 3 Reconstruction Amendments, passed to rebuild the nation and secure the rights of newly freed African Americans. It was a monumental step, but the clause "except as a punishment for a crime" would prove to be a significant and tragic loophole. In the post-war South, this exception was exploited through black codes and convict leasing systems, which effectively re-enslaved many black men by convicting them of minor crimes and forcing them into labor. Despite this failing, the 13th Amendment marked a profound moral and legal break with the nation's past and laid the groundwork for future civil rights struggles. If the 13th Amendment ended slavery, the 14th, ratified in 1868, sought to define the meaning of freedom and citizenship. It is arguably the most important amendment outside of the Bill of Rights. Its first section is revolutionary. It grants citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, directly overturning the Dred Scott decision which had denied citizenship to African Americans. It then forbids states from abridging the privileges or immunities of citizens. This was a massive shift of power, applying new restrictions on the states. Most importantly, it declares that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The due process and equal protection clauses have become the legal foundation for almost all modern civil rights litigation. The Supreme Court has used the Due Process Clause to apply most of the Bill of Rights to the states, a process called incorporation, and the Equal Protection Clause to strike down segregation in Brown v. Board of Education, and to support everything from disability rights to marriage equality. The 14th Amendment fundamentally redefined the relationship between the individual, the states, and the federal government. The third and final Reconstruction Amendment, the 15th, was ratified in 1870. It aimed to secure one of the most fundamental rights of citizenship, the right to vote. It states that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This was a radical step, at least on paper. It meant that states could no longer explicitly ban black men from voting. However, the promise of the 15th Amendment was brutally suppressed for nearly a century. Southern states quickly devised ways to get around it without mentioning race. They implemented poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and used intimidation and violence to prevent African Americans from exercising their right to vote. The amendment gave Congress the power to enforce it, but that power went largely unused until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. The passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the moment when the federal government finally stepped in to truly enforce the command of the 15th Amendment, dismantling many of these discriminatory barriers. Let's talk about something everyone loves: taxes. The 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913, explicitly gave Congress the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration. This was, honestly, a huge change. Before this, the Constitution required that any direct taxes be apportioned among the states based on population. Back in 1895, the Supreme Court had struck down a national income tax, calling it a direct tax that wasn't properly apportioned. The 16th Amendment directly overrode that court decision. It was a product of the Progressive Era, a time of reform aimed at addressing the massive wealth inequality of the Gilded Age. Supporters argued that an income tax was a fairer way to raise revenue, since it could be made progressive, meaning wealthier people would pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes. This amendment fundamentally transformed the federal government, providing it with a massive and steady stream of revenue that allowed it to grow and fund programs, a military, and infrastructure on a scale that was previously unimaginable. And, well, your paycheck stub is a direct descendant of this amendment. Also a product of the Progressive Era, the 17th Amendment, ratified in 1913, changed the way we choose our U.S. senators. Originally, the Constitution stipulated that senators were to be chosen by state legislatures, not by the people directly. The idea was that senators would be more deliberative, elder statesmen, insulated from the whims of popular opinion, representing the interests of their states' governments. But by the late 19th century, this system was seen as corrupt and undemocratic. Senate seats were often bought and sold through bribery of state legislators, and legislative deadlock sometimes meant states went without representation in the Senate for years. The 17th Amendment was the solution. It mandated that senators be elected by popular vote, just like members of the House of Representatives. This was a major victory for the populist and progressive movements, which championed the idea of giving more power directly to the people. It made the Senate a more democratic institution, directly accountable to the voters of each state. Here we have one of the most famous and famously failed amendments in U.S. history, the 18th. Ratified in 1919, it prohibited the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the United States. This was the culmination of decades of activism by the temperance movement, which saw alcohol as the root of many of society's problems, including poverty, domestic violence, and crime. They called it the Noble Experiment. The experiment, however, was, well, a spectacular failure. Instead of creating a more moral society, Prohibition gave rise to a massive black market for alcohol. It fueled the growth of organized crime as gangsters like Al Capone built empires on bootlegging. It created a culture of speakeasies and illegal stills, and turned millions of ordinary Americans into lawbreakers. The government spent enormous resources trying to enforce a law that a huge portion of the population simply refused to obey. It was a lesson in the limits of using the Constitution to legislate morality on a national scale. Ratified in 1920, the 19th Amendment is another landmark of American democracy. Its language is simple and echoes the 15th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. This was the triumphant result of the women's suffrage movement, a struggle that had been waged for over 70 years, beginning in earnest at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Generations of women, including figures like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Alice Paul, organized, protested, lobbied, and were even arrested and imprisoned in their fight for the right to vote. They argued that a country that called itself a democracy could not deny the franchise to half its population. The passage of the 19th Amendment was a monumental step forward, doubling the electorate and fundamentally changing the political landscape. It affirmed the principle that women, as citizens, were entitled to the same rights and responsibilities of citizenship as men, including the most basic right of choosing their leaders. The 20th Amendment, ratified in 1933, is a practical one that cleans up the presidential and congressional calendars. Before this amendment, there was a long 4-month lame duck period between the November election and the start of the new presidential and congressional terms on March 4th. This meant that defeated or retiring politicians, the lame ducks, would continue to hold office for months, often with little political power or accountability. This long delay was a holdover from the 18th century, when travel and communication were slow. The 20th Amendment modernized the timeline. It moved the start date for the new president and vice president up to January 20th, and for new members of Congress to January 3rd. This significantly shortened the lame duck period, allowing the newly elected officials to take office and begin their work much sooner. It also clarified the rules for presidential succession in the event that a president-elect dies before taking office, specifying that the vice president-elect would become president. It's a nuts and bolts amendment that makes the transition of power more efficient and sensible for the modern era. Here it is, the only amendment in the Constitution that exists solely to repeal another one. Ratified in 1933, the 21st Amendment officially ended the era of Prohibition by repealing the 18th Amendment. The Great Depression played a big role. The government desperately needed the tax revenue that legal alcohol sales would generate, and the public was eager for the jobs that a revitalized brewing and distilling industry would create. The noble experiment had been widely discredited as unenforceable and criminogenic. The 21st Amendment is unique for another reason. It's the only amendment to have been ratified by state conventions rather than state legislatures. This was done to bypass rural-dominated legislatures that were still heavily influenced by the temperance movement and to get a more direct measure of popular opinion. Section 2 of the amendment does, however, give states the power to continue to regulate or ban alcohol within their own borders, which is why we still have a patchwork of different state and local liquor laws, including dry counties across the country today. The 22nd Amendment, ratified in 1951, sets a 2-term limit for the President of the United States. For the first 150 years of the country's history, the 2-term limit was just a tradition, started by George Washington. Every president followed his example until Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was elected to an unprecedented 4 terms, serving from 1933 until his death in 1945. While FDR was immensely popular, his long tenure in office raised concerns about the potential for a single person to accumulate too much power. In response, Congress passed, and the states ratified the 22nd Amendment. It says that no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice. It also specifies that if a vice president takes over for a president who has more than 2 years left in their term, they can only be elected to 1 more full term. This amendment constitutionalized Washington's precedent, ensuring that the presidency would have regular turnover and preventing the rise of a president for life. It really reflects a deep-seated American skepticism of concentrated executive power. For most of its history, the citizens of Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, had no say in who became president. They paid federal taxes, served in the military, and were subject to federal laws, but they couldn't vote in presidential elections. This was because the Constitution specifies that the president is chosen by electors from the states, and D.C. is a federal district, not a state. This situation was often decried as taxation without representation. The 23rd Amendment, ratified in 1961, partially rectified this. It grants the District of Columbia electors in the Electoral College, allowing its residents to vote for president and vice president. The number of electors D.C. gets is equal to the number it would have if it were a state, but no more than the least populous state. As of today, that means D.C. has 3 electoral votes. While this amendment gave D.C. residents a voice in presidential elections, the debate over D.C.'s status continues, with ongoing calls for it to have voting representation in Congress or even to become the 51st state. Ratified in 1964, the 24th Amendment was a major victory for the civil rights movement. It declares that the right to vote in any federal election for president, vice president, or Congress cannot be denied by reason of failure to pay any poll tax or other tax. Poll taxes were fees that had to be paid in order to vote. While they sounded neutral, they were used for decades, primarily in the South, as a tool to disenfranchise poor voters, particularly African Americans. Along with literacy tests and intimidation, the poll tax was a key part of the Jim Crow system that suppressed the black vote after the 15th Amendment was passed. By the 1960s, only 5 southern states still had poll taxes, but they remained a significant barrier to voting. The 24th Amendment eliminated this barrier in federal elections. 2 years later, the Supreme Court, in Harper v. Virginia Board of Elections, extended this ban to state elections as well, ruling that any property qualification for voting was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. The 25th Amendment, ratified in 1967, clarifies the complex and sometimes murky rules of presidential succession and disability. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963 highlighted the need for a more detailed plan. The amendment has 4 key sections. Section 1 is simple. If the president dies, resigns, or is removed, the vice president becomes president. Section 2 establishes a process for filling a vacancy in the office of the vice president. The president nominates a vice president, who must be confirmed by a majority of both houses of Congress. Sections 3 and 4 are the most innovative. Section 3 allows a president to temporarily transfer power to the vice president if they know they will be incapacitated, for example, if they are undergoing surgery. The president can then reclaim their powers when they are able. Section 4 provides a mechanism for removing a president who is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, but is unwilling or unable to step down. This can be initiated by the vice president and a majority of the cabinet. This amendment provides a clear and orderly process for ensuring the nation always has a capable leader at the helm. The 26th Amendment, ratified in 1971, lowered the national voting age from 21 to 18. The driving force behind this change was the Vietnam War. The slogan, "Old enough to fight, old enough to vote," captured the widespread sentiment that it was unjust to draft 18-year-olds to fight and potentially die for their country, when they had no voice in electing the leaders who sent them to war. The push for a lower voting age had been around for a while, but the political pressure during the Vietnam era made it unstoppable. In 1970, Congress passed an extension of the Voting Rights Act that included a provision lowering the voting age to 18 in all elections. However, the Supreme Court, in Oregon v. Mitchell, ruled that Congress only had the power to set the voting age for federal elections, not state and local ones. To avoid the confusion of having 2 different voting ages, Congress quickly proposed the 26th Amendment. It was ratified in just 100 days, the fastest ratification of any amendment in U.S. history, enfranchising millions of young Americans. And finally, we arrive at the 27th and most recent amendment, which has a truly bizarre history. It states, "No law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened." In other words, if Congress gives itself a pay raise, that raise can't go into effect until after the next congressional election. This allows voters to theoretically throw the bums out if they disapprove of the pay raise. The weird part? This amendment was originally proposed by James Madison in 1789 as part of the original Bill of Rights, but while the other 10 amendments were ratified by 1791, this one languished. It didn't have a time limit for ratification, so it just sat there, being occasionally ratified by a state here and there over the centuries. Then, in 1982, a university student in Texas, named Gregory Watson, discovered the dormant proposal while researching a paper. He started a nationwide letter-writing campaign to get the remaining states to ratify it. It slowly gained momentum, and in 1992, Michigan became the 38th state to ratify it, finally making it part of the Constitution, 202 years, 7 months, and 12 days after it was first proposed. And that's a quick overview of all 27 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. From the fundamental freedoms of the First Amendment to the strange journey of the 27th, each one tells a story. They are a reflection of our nation's history, a chronicle of its struggles, its failures, and its aspirations. They show a country wrestling with its own ideals, trying to correct its original sins like slavery, and adapting to new challenges like technology, war, and social change. The Constitution isn't a static, dusty document. It's a dynamic framework that has been bent, stretched, and reshaped by the American people over more than 2 centuries. This was, by necessity, a very fast tour. Each of these amendments has a rich history and a complex body of legal interpretation behind it that we could spend hours on. They are the subject of entire books and law school courses. So I strongly encourage you to see this video not as an end, but as a beginning. If you want to dive deeper, check out more resources in the description. I've linked to the National Constitution Center, which has fantastic, detailed explanations of each amendment, as well as other great sources for further reading. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep engaging with these foundational ideas. Being a citizen in a democracy is not a passive activity. It requires us to understand the rules of the game and the principles we're supposed to be fighting for. These amendments are those rules and principles. Thank you so much for coming on this constitutional journey with me here at Bees Boys Tinkerings. I hope you found it useful. Thanks for watching.